sort of lamenting that he wished he were more like a cow, because cows were not worried about the future, not thinking about their past, just sort of happily in the moment. And he envied them for not being smart enough to think about complex topics like nihilism that made him so miserable.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, we're speaking with Justin Gregg. Justin Gregg is a science writer and author, most recently of If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal, What Animal Intelligence Reveals About Human Stupidity. He writes about animal behavior and cognition for the Wall Street Journal, Aeon, Scientific American, BBC Focus, Slate, and others. He is also an adjunct professor at St. Francis Xavier University and a senior research associate with the Dolphin Communication Project, where he studies dolphin social cognition. His recent story in Nautilus was an excerpt from his new book. We titled it The Wisdom of Gay Albatrosses. Same-sex couples are everywhere in the animal kingdom. Only humans make a big deal about it. Justin, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Brian. Nice to meet you.
So why don't you give us a brief background of yourself? How did you get involved in studying dolphins and animal cognition? And what was the inspiration for your book?
Yeah, I studied linguistics actually as my undergraduate degree because I was very much interested in human language. But that I had always been interested in animals, and I especially loved whales and dolphins. And there was no obvious way to link linguistics to the study of dolphins until you get into the question of how language evolved and how similar it is to dolphin communication, because we knew they were smart and they had a complex communication system. So that's how I sort of dovetailed my interest in language into the study of dolphins. And so then I began studying animal cognition in general, and I lecture on animal cognition. And so this book sort of came out of all of the writing and the thinking I do about animal cognition, specifically because people always want to know, when an animal does something interesting, how human-like that behavior is or how human-like their thinking is. So my jumping off point was, well, why do we always need to compare it to human intelligence? And is human intelligence even all that great to begin with? Maybe it's a problem to think like a human.
So your excerpt, or what we excerpted from your book, was once again titled "The Wisdom of Gay Albatrosses." Do you want to give us a brief summary of that story for our viewers who may not have read it yet?
Yeah, it was from a chapter on morality in humans, and it was contrasting how animals have normative systems and humans have moral systems, which are more complicated. But then the question was, just because we have a more complex moral system, does that make us more moral? Are we nicer than animals? So the article, it starts off with a description of chimpanzees being relatively violent. They're much more violent sort of on a day-to-day basis than humans, especially when they get together in groups. And humans are much more civil. When we're like in New York City, there's not all that much violence when you're walking down the street, unlike if they were chimpanzees. But my point was but when humans do decide to commit violence, like during acts of war, we can go above and beyond with the amount of death and destruction and misery that we can cause. And that's also partly justified by our ability to come up with a moral reason for needing to go to war. And so the problem with human moral reasoning, as I describe in the article, is that we can come up with moral justifications for doing really cruel things. And I use homophobia as the main focus. And I note that in the animal kingdom, there are a lot of same-sex behavior is happening, whether or not that's sex or just two animals pairing off together. But there are no animal social systems that punish animals for engaging in same-sex behavior. Only humans do that. And that's because we've rationalized ourselves into a corner with our moral systems where we become strangely intolerant of same-sex behavior. And so I point that out as a system that creates a lot of unhappiness and misery and death for a lot of other humans for no real good reason, at which point we don't, I think that's a huge problem. And animals maybe have a better system.
So when you were thinking about that topic, about normative systems as they manifest themselves in animals and humans, what were some of your first thoughts in how to go about writing that?
Yeah, you have to contrast the difference between a normative system and a moral system. So, of course, you need good examples. So, I had to look at the literature from other people who actually study this professionally, philosophers, and see what they talk about when they talk about normativity in animals and how it contrasts with morality. So, I provide a couple interesting examples in the book. One I really like in terms of what is a norm. So, a norm is a kind of emotion that guides behavior for animals, but also for humans. So it's not a thing we necessarily think about or teach each other. It's just a thing that crops up naturally in a social system. So if you and I were walking down the street, for example, we don't know each other. So if I were to just see you on the street and you had a bunch of like jam or jelly on the side of your face from lunch that was just stuck in the corner of your mouth, it would be really strange for me to go up to you, who I don't know, and wipe that off. Because that's not how our system works. There's a norm that prevents me from wiping food off of a stranger's face. And that's not something your parents necessarily teach you. It's just something that crops up that guides our behavior. And so that's what a normative system is, and that's how animal norms work. And then you get into morals and the complex philosophical reasons for things being right or wrong. And so it's all about finding good examples that explain exactly what you mean when writing a book like this.
Are moral systems in human culture elaborations and specifications of normative systems? Did humans first have normative systems before we came up with moral systems? What exactly is the connection there?
Yeah, I would say normative systems guide all animal behavior, especially social animals. But humans have a bunch of cognitive skills that allow us to think about our norms. So we have theory of mind, we have the language ability, we have uh, a knowledge of cause and effect. And when you add all of these separate cognitive skills that sort of evolved for different reasons to solve different problems, and you apply them to what norms are and what behavior is, you start getting a lot of like, I ought to do this, I should do this, because if I don't, then this will happen. And you're drawing all these complicated conclusions and relationships. And that's how something like religion or philosophy or just general normative systems turn into moral systems. It's when you explicitly think about why things should or shouldn't happen that morality pops up. So it is a natural outcropping of a normative system.
What was the impetus for you for writing this recent book, and how does Nietzsche come into your description and exploration of the different cognitive systems that humans and animals have?
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in this question of whether or not intelligence is a good thing. Just because as I was saying before, like people are always so excited when they see an animal behave like a human. And I'm like, well, maybe that's not so good for the animal. Maybe there's a problem with human intelligence because when you look around at all the things we've created, climate change is the obvious example. We're kind of doing dangerous things to ourselves. So I use Nietzsche as a frame because Nietzsche quite famously had a passage that he wrote about cows in a field, and he was sort of lamenting that he wished he were more like a cow because cows were not worried about the future, not thinking about their past, just sort of happily in the moment. And he envied them for not being smart enough to think about complex topics like nihilism that made him so miserable. So that was the reason I chose Nietzsche specifically, and because he also had that same question, like, is my intelligence and thinking and all this making me a happier or a better person? So that's how I ended up with Nietzsche as the frame for the book.
Well, in the case of Nietzsche, didn't he plausibly have a severe mental illness? So perhaps he was misattributing his misery. Maybe it wasn't his intelligence and perceptiveness, but just an unfortunate case of an illness.
Yeah, he certainly did have things going on. It's unknown exactly what was happening with him, but it was also compounded with his, serious intellect and ability to think about and philosophize about what was going on in his own mind. So I think it was an interesting combination of those two things. And I mean, it is an interesting question because thinking too hard about anything does provide a lot of misery for us humans. It's anxiety is often caused by thoughts running around in your head that you wish weren't there, complicated, sometimes linguistic, sometimes other kinds of thoughts. And so in my own personal life, I think too much about things and I worry too much. And it would be nicer if I could just calm all those smart thoughts down in my brain and just relax for a bit. So that's kind of what Nietzsche was talking about, maybe inspired by his own internal misery from mental disorders, but he still thought about it because he was a human and he could.
So you also have an interest in the evolution of language. Do you have any idea why we might have evolved this capacity or misfortune for having so many chattering thoughts within ourselves that seem to come out of nowhere, and we can become captured by them and not realize that we're following a line of thought that we might not want to follow, and we become so attached and identified to it when we can just let it go.
Yeah, it's like everything in evolution. It's just problematic enough to not be a problem. So as long as it's providing enough benefit, then it's going to be selected for. And it's obvious with language the utility of language. You and I can share thoughts. I can guess what's going on in your head and provide these weird sounds out of my mouth, which puts thoughts and ideas in your head. It's an amazing system for conveying really complicated subjects, not just concrete subjects, but like abstract thoughts between two individuals. And that allows us to coordinate our behavior and manipulate each other and create these huge social systems. I mean, the whole planet is blanketed with human beings creating what we've created through the medium of language. So it's obviously worked out really well for us in that sense, even though, of course, like it does provide misery and when the thoughts run rampant in our head, but it also gives us music and poetry, and those are sometimes very good things.
Can you share any interesting bits in your research that you thought you might include in the book, but ended up taking out for whatever reason, for length or whatnot?
Yeah, I actually had an entire chapter that was all about brains and brain size and these hypotheses as to why humans have large brains and why dolphins have large brains or crows have relatively large brains. And it was it was a big, long, beautiful chapter all about the relationship between brains and intelligence, especially because there's exciting research coming out of folks who study insects like Lars Chitka, showing that with a really tiny brain, an insect can accomplish really complicated things and might have something akin to consciousness. And so it was a whole chapter about that. But when we looked at the book as a whole, we realized like it's almost a bit of a tangent. And so I just cut the whole darn chapter. It's amazing when you're writing a book like this how much you cut out. I have a file that just contains all the passages I cut out called unused passages, and it's like 35,000 words long. It's practically a second book. And I had a bunch of stuff about artificial intelligence, which I really love, but I don't understand it that well. So I was excited to research it. And then we realized, that too is a bit of a tangent. So maybe another book, it'll fit in another book at another time.
Definitely. Thinking about the liabilities of human intelligence and how it can ironically produce mass scale stupidity, do you have any intuitions about, say, intelligence from other beings in the galaxy or the universe, about the Fermi paradox? Is intelligence something that eventually leads to self destruction, as we're seeing with our activity on our own planet?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that I didn't address necessarily in the book, but I don't have a solid answer for that. But I do know that the nature of the problem of our species when it comes to our intelligence is that we've coupled it together with all of our primate social needs. So, we're a species that is always trying to manipulate each other and lying and deceiving. And we're often in competition with other humans around the planet. So we don't work very well collectively. And that's sort of a product of our ape background. So it's interesting to imagine, even if there was another alien system out there that worked on natural selection that created biological organisms as we would recognize them, if another kind of animal had evolved a different intelligence but didn't have these sort of ape-like issues, like like an insect kind of species, maybe they'd be fundamentally different in how they were doing, in terms of what their intelligence is doing for them. And for us, it's kind of a danger at the moment, but maybe for them, it's they're more like the Borg. They're just really good at assimilating, and you have this collective hive mind, and everything is just going along swimmingly, and they're not self-destructive.
Yeah. I suspect that if we do find intelligence in outer space somewhere, it would probably be AI. What do you think?
Yes, that's possible. Of course, then who created the AI? That's what's exciting about speculating. Is we always think of biological systems and natural selection is what generates forms, but you can imagine anything else like atoms, chemicals floating around in a cloud that for some reason have a capacity for action and agency and can create things. And so it's not a biological kind of system at all. So it functions almost more like a computer than it does a life form, an individual life form. So certainly anything is possible. I mean, our kind of intelligence is this generalist problem solving intelligence that we use in our lives to fulfill our needs. But maybe there's an AI like system on another planet that doesn't have those sorts of needs at all and just does things. I don't know. It's fun speculation.
Yeah, definitely. What are you working on at the moment? Do you have any articles or perhaps another book in the works?
I do have another book idea, and my editor was just asking me what it was, but I told him I'm not going to tell him because it's still percolating, and so I can't
Yeah.
tell you, or he'd be very upset. But yeah, I'm really fascinated with these discussions now around long termism and the future, and so I'm I that is a subject I might come in on, not along those same lines as the long termism folks, but I think there's something that we can learn about longevity and living a good life from thinking about animal intelligence versus human intelligence. So maybe there's some lessons in there for us.
Speaking of long termism, have you checked out William McCaskill's new book, What We Owe the Future, or seen the profile of him in the New Yorker?
Yeah, I've read about it. The book is literally on its way to me, so I'm hoping to look into it. But it's really interesting. I don't know if you're following all the discussions online around it, because some people are huge proponents, some people have found some flaws, and some people really hate the long termism ideology and some of the people behind it. So it's quite a contentious, exciting debate. And I don't yet know enough about it to weigh in on it. So I'm excited to read it. I don't know. Have you read it yet?
I have it on my shelf, but I haven't read it yet. No.
Yeah, and there's a number of books out there that are interesting along those topics. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's an exciting time for thinking about the future. I feel like right now it's definitely with this climate emergency issue. I feel like it's on everyone's minds at this moment in time. And so it's a good moment to think about the nature of humanity and what we owe the future, as they say, or how we can plan our future and what prevents us from making good future decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a subject that would inevitably come up given the nature of our collective problems. They seem to be long term problems that don't admit of any kind of short term solution. And because our political systems are set up around short term elections and appealing to short term interests, it seems a terrible match for dealing with these issues that will stretch into the future beyond our lifetimes.
That's it. And I have a whole section in the book where I discuss that problem, which is called prognostic myopia, I called it. And that's that our brains are designed for dealing with short term problems because, like every other animal on the planet, we evolved to deal with the here and now. Humans, we have these weird abilities that allow us to think about the future. And that's brand new as a thing out there. So our biology isn't very good at caring about the distant future. We really only care about the moment. And that means most of our decisions are short term. Like you say, our political systems, our economic systems, they're about short term gain, not 300 years out in the future. And that's because we're fighting our own biology and psychology in a way. We're not designed to make good long term decisions. especially collectively.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if any being might be designed to do that, it would be AI, perhaps. And I guess that's part of the reason
Yeah.
why I would expect AI to be in outer space, as well as beings able to create that kind of technology would probably send out kind of probes to go explore. But yeah, that's a fascinating
Yeah,
discussion, perhaps for another time.
I had a whole section in my book where I speculated about AI for exactly that reason. Like, you can design an AI that is focused on making good long-term decisions, and it's not saddled with all of these human biological problems, and that we could outsource decision making to an AI. I mean, that's a thing you see in science fiction. I mean, isn't the Scythe novel? There's so many examples of an AI making decisions for humanity. And of course, that has its own set of awful, terrible problems. Like, the AI might decide that everyone needs to die except for like 10 people, because that's So I don't know if it's the best solution, but I do know exactly what you're saying, which is, if in outer space, the thing that probably is doing the best is probably not a big, dumb primate species in a little box spaceship popping around the universe, because we're generally bad at surviving long enough to go explore other planets, like in Star Trek.
I do suspect, though, that because there seems to be a lot of evidence of convergent evolution, where evolution will happen upon similar solutions to like the same problems that widely different species encounter, that if a species is going to be able to develop a spacefaring technology, it will have to be able to create tools and technology. And so we'll have to be able to manipulate matter in a way that humans can with hands and so forth. So part of me thinks that somehow an alien species that is able to go to space would be quite human like, just because of the restrictions that sort of nature would place on any species that is able to go out there and make technology. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's what's fun about speculating, because yes, that sounds logical, but I always like to think of, like, well, why do we need convergent evolution? Why natural selection at all? What about a system that is not natural selection in origin, or what about a kind of thing that is just a collection of molecules that can survive space and somehow still do something? Does it need a physical form that relies on gravity, that needs sunlight, that requires hands to manipulate things? Perhaps there's other ways of getting around and still making decisions. Does it even need to replicate? That's what all biology here is the requirement to replicate. But what about a thing that doesn't need to replicate for whatever reason? So, the world is your oyster when it comes to thinking up things out there, and even deciding what intelligence even is. I mean, imagine a system that doesn't need to communicate whatsoever, because you have an immortal, non-replicating being that can still do things, but doesn't need to ever communicate with any other beings because it's never seen one. Then you couldn't communicate with it. There would be no language. So, yeah, this is why science fiction is so fun. Maybe I'll work on a
I
science
agree.
fiction book.
Yeah. Have you read any recent science fiction you can recommend?
I love sci. Let's see. I was reading the Murder Bot. I don't know if you've read Murder Bot. It's great fun.
No.
And then The Ministry for the Future, obviously quite good. I'm just finishing that up. Um, yeah, I think those are the two
Kim
that
Stanley
are.
Robinson, right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's good stuff. So, I mean, there's so much of it. I love it.
Yeah. All right, Justin, you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online to follow your work and see where you're up to online?
Yeah, I on all the social medias, I'm usually Justin D. Gregg, like on the Twitter and all that. So I usually crop up on there, talking about dolphins or animal intelligence or whatnot. The Dolphin Communication Project, that's the research group I work with. So you can visit their website and catch up on our dolphin work that we do. Yeah, I think that's where I am. Otherwise, go to a local indie bookstore and look for If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal. That's most of my interesting thoughts are in there. Twitter is just filled with, like, what I had for breakfast or whatever.
And one final question: if you weren't a scientist, what do you think you would be up to?
Well, I'm only a part-time scientist, really. I worked as a voice actor. I work in theater. I record music. I teach improv. That's a thing that I do. So I'm already doing a lot of weird artsy things, but I don't think my publicist wants me to talk about those because I'm supposed to be a very serious scientist. So forget I said anything.
Okay, all right, all right, Justin. It's been great. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for talking.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It was fun.